Let's talk about primary and secondary sources. So first of all, let's talk about what is primary research. Well, you are not doing primary research in this class, but you're going to rely on primary sources, which comes from primary research. So what is primary research? Primary research is any research in which a person is completing the research themselves. So interviews, surveys, observations, analysis, any research in which a person is doing interviews and coming up with a conclusion, or maybe giving out a survey and running it through a statistical analysis and coming up with a conclusion, or perhaps observing people and behavior, or maybe analyzing something like analyzing a script or a novel. Primary research is done by a person who does the investigation themselves and then writes about the results in the investigation themselves. And so primary research results in what's called primary sources. So when the person conducting the primary research writes about it, that's a primary source. Primary sources include conference papers, journal articles, creative works, and even relics or artifacts are primary sources. For example, if you were studying Egyptian religion and you went to a museum that had several statues from Egypt, those relics or artifacts could be primary sources. You could learn something about those artifacts by looking at them. So let's take a look at a primary source. This is a screenshot of a research paper from Sport Marketing Quarterly, 2012, issue 21, and this is a journal article called Social Media and Sports Marketing, Examining the Motivations and Constraints of Twitter Users. And initially at the top after the title, we have the names of the people who both did the research and wrote this article showing their findings. So this is a primary source. And in the abstract, we have an explanation of the type of primary research that they did. So we have this sentence that says structural equation modeling method with a convenience sample of 1,124 respondents was employed to analyze the conceptual framework and elements of the scale. So what that really means is we did a survey of 1,124 people. So they're telling you in this abstract and later on in the paper as well the type of primary research they did, which was a survey and then analysis of the survey data. Let's talk about secondary sources because you may use some of those in your project as well. Secondary sources are sources that interpret and analyze primary sources. So any publications that quote or maybe screenshot original or primary sources would be secondary sources. Many books or book chapters are written based on primary sources. So in the book or book chapter, the author interprets and analyzes the research of others. Essays also can be secondary sources if the essay interprets and analyzes the research of others. So let's look at a secondary source. This is a book called How Social Media is Changing Sports. Actually, the title is It's a Whole New Ballgame, How Social Media is Changing Sports. And you have the author's name at the bottom. And in this book, the author discusses other people's studies and interprets their findings. So Jimmy Sanderson isn't doing interviews, he isn't doing observation, he isn't out there watching behaviors of people and collecting survey data or something like that. Instead, he's consulting other sources, people who have done research, people who have done case studies, and he's sort of interpreting how they all fit together. So he looks at their studies, he looks at the findings, and presents his analysis of how they all fit together and what it might mean for how social media is changing sports. Now, there's some pitfalls to be aware of as you look at primary research, and there's some pitfalls to be aware of as you look at secondary research as well. But with primary research, you want to be aware that you're not overgeneralizing the results, that you are not falling for any kind of biased methodology. Keep in mind that correlation does not imply causation, and you've probably heard this before, but this is a very important concept that I'll explain in more depth in a minute. You might not be considering other related factors, and keep in mind that people's reported behavior is not always the same as their actual behavior. So let's look at these and break them down one by one. One pitfall of primary research is overgeneralizing the results. So here's a study on the left. Korean adolescent girls' addictive use of mobile phones to maintain interpersonal solidarity. And if you read the abstract at the top, you'll see that the authors claim that their results show that those who have a greater tendency to be addicted sent numerous text messages from places such as schools where the excessive use of mobile phones can be a problem. So you may be tempted to generalize from this that young people have a problem with using social media and using mobile phones in school. But you may not necessarily be able to generalize that. For starters, this is a study that was done in Korea, and we really need to ask ourselves, how similar would we expect the results from high schools and teenage girls in Korea to be to high schools and teenage girls in America? In America, the cultural differences may be so great that we can't generalize these results. We need to make sure we don't generalize these results from girls to boys. This study specifically only looked at girls' use of mobile phones, and so we can't generalize this and say that all teenagers, who have a tendency to be addicted are going to send text messages from places such as schools where it can be a problem. So it's really not true to take the study and say that, teenagers who have a greater tendency to be addicted send more text messages from places like schools. That's not what the study says. The study says that young girls in Korea who have a tendency to be addicted send more text messages from places like schools. Now, this idea that these teenagers tend to be addicted, that's another thing you want to watch out for. These are students who already have a tendency to become addicted to social media. So you can't generalize this and say all teenagers send text messages from school where it can be a problem, because not all teenagers have a tendency to become addicted to things like this. So make sure you're not overgeneralizing the results. If the study says Korean adolescent girls who tend to become addicted to social media send text messages from school, that's exactly what it means. It doesn't mean boys do. It doesn't mean American high school students do. It doesn't mean that everybody does, and it doesn't correlate. It doesn't become generalized to everybody. So keep that in mind as you conduct your research. You want to watch out for biased methodology. In biased methodology, the methodology that the researcher uses in their study is just not sound. For example, if a researcher studies social media usage and they ask questions like, isn't it true that social media can be bad for you? That's a question that, for starters, is a little bit leading. Saying you agree or disagree with social media being bad for you is actually different from starting out by saying, isn't it true? And this also could be confusing because some people may not know whether yes means it is true or whether yes means it's not true because of the way it's worded. So you want to look out for methodologies that seemingly don't make sense or that lead the user or the survey taker or whatever to make a mistake in their answer. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one caused the other. And there's lots of examples of this. Gizmodo put together an article in which they showed a lot of things that correlate that do not imply causation. And here's one on the left: Internet Explorer versus murder rate. As the Internet Explorer market share decreased and other browsers like Safari, Chrome, and Firefox became more prevalent, murder rate in the US dropped as well. And these two things happened at the same time, but it doesn't mean that they caused each other. It would be absolutely insane to say that Internet Explorer affects the murder rate. We have no evidence of that. Just because the murder rate and the use of Internet Explorer went down at the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. Another example is actually a social media example. A couple years ago, researchers found that people who have a lower sense of well-being than average use Facebook more. And a lot of media outlets wrote these deceptive headlines that said things like, Facebook makes you depressed. Well, just because people who have a lower sense of well-being than average use Facebook more doesn't mean that Facebook and well-being are necessarily causes of each other. It could be that Facebook makes people feel less well, but it also could be because people who already don't feel good want to look at Facebook to feel better, or it could be because feeling not very good makes people want to look at Facebook because they're bored, because they don't feel good about themselves. We really don't know, and this study did not answer this question. The study did not look at the reasons why Facebook might be related to a lower sense of well-being. So those articles that I saw online that said things like Facebook makes you depressed, that is not what this study is saying. Correlation does not imply causation. Just because people with a lower sense of well-being are on Facebook more doesn't necessarily mean Facebook and well-being cause shifts in the other, just like Internet Explorer doesn't affect the murder rate. Another pitfall of research is not considering other related factors. For example, some research studies, early research studies into lung cancer, suggested that smoking caused lung cancer. At the same time, some organizations that worked in the cigarette industry tried to claim that hidden factors may cause lung cancer. If I get lung cancer and I smoke, is it from the smoking, or do I maybe have a pre-existing condition that makes me more susceptible to lung cancer just from natural causes and not from smoking? So just because there's a pretty good argument for one thing to cause the other, it doesn't mean you should stop looking for another hidden factor or something else that might influence it. It's still difficult to say what the relationship is between hidden factors in smoking and lung cancer, although it's very clear because of many research studies that smoking does have a role in causing lung cancer. So you want to make sure that you're not leaving out other related factors. And this really goes back to correlation does not imply causation. Just because people with low sense of well-being use Facebook more, there could be another factor that correlates to both a low sense of well-being and an increase in Facebook. For example, maybe people who live in abusive homes have a lower sense of well-being because of the abuse, but maybe they also use Facebook more because of the abuse. It drives them to stay home and not go in public where they could be found out or something like that. So you don't want to ignore the chance that there could be another related factor. And then finally, you want to watch out for reported versus actual behavior. You may feel a lot of times that you answer surveys honestly, but do you? I took a survey the other day about grocery stores, and the survey asked me how many rewards cards I carried, and I answered about 20. When I actually looked at my keys and I looked at my rewards cards, I had 10. So I was completely unaware of how many I had. For some reason, I thought I had way more than I did. So you just want to watch out for surveys that invite people to report things that are self-reported that may not be actual. So keep in mind that reported versus actual behavior may be different. Now, there's also a lot of pitfalls when it comes to looking at secondary sources, and the major one is that the author may not be interpreting the data correctly. So anytime it's possible when you're looking at secondary sources, get the primary source. If you're reading a book and a person points to a study and they say, well, according to this study, this is true, go look at that study and judge for yourself. Whenever possible, get the primary source. So this means that at the end of your research, you'll have almost entirely primary sources. You may use secondary sources as a starting point to find research, but you'll hunt that trail down back to the primary resource. And here's a good example of how secondary sources can misinterpret. The Facebook causes depression example is a good one, but here's another one. There's actually a video from one of the authors of this study online, and he recounts how this whole thing became misinterpreted. But one of the authors of this study, Online Voluntary Control of Human Temporal Lobe Neurons, wrote in this paper is basically about how people perceive and if they can change their perception of something. So if you look at the method of the study, 12 patients who had pharmacologically intractable epilepsy, so that means people with epilepsy that can't be cured or controlled very well with a medicine, had implants, deep electrode implants that were put into their brain to localize the epileptic focus for possible subsequent resection. So they have these implants in their brain. And what the study did is for each patient, they ran tests where they had the patients look at things and then they interpreted the signals they were getting from those electrodes. Now, when presenting this information in, I believe it was an interview, one of the researchers who participated in this research mentioned that it would be neat to use a similar type of implant to look at dreams if that was possible. And it was sort of an afterthought. He talked about the study and then he said, oh yeah, wouldn't that be neat? And as a result, that's what got picked up in the media. And you started to see headlines like this: dream recording device possible, researcher claims. And then you see that first sentence, writing in the journal Nature, researchers said they had developed a system capable of recording higher level brain activity. They're referring to the exact same thing you saw. This, and the rest of it, which is not pictured here. And from that, they came up with this headline, dream recording device possible, researcher claims. That's not what the study was about. This interpretation of the study does not show an understanding of the study and a correct interpretation of the results. So when you're dealing with secondary sources, be aware that they can misinterpret research. You want to find the primary research if possible. And when you're selecting research, it can be easier to start out with some secondary sources, some blog posts, some newspaper articles, but you want to follow the trail from secondary to primary and then look at the content of the source. Is the content trying to imply causation that's not there? Is the methodology sound? And then look at the source and be very wary of sources that ask non-experts to interpret. So any sources that are blogs written by laypersons or newspaper articles written by a reporter who's not specifically versed in this topic, be really wary of how they interpret the research. These are still good sources because from the article or from the blog, you can get the name and sometimes the location of the primary research, which then you can use in your paper and you can interpret yourself, hopefully in the correct way. So, couple pitfalls of primary and secondary research, a couple examples of primary and secondary research. You're going to rely generally on primary research, but you might reach that research through secondary sources. So I hope this video has shown you the difference between the two. If you have any further questions about the difference between primary and secondary research or how you judge research in terms of your research question and your thesis, please feel free to send them my way. I would be glad to answer them.